Okay, everyone here. Well, a very good evening to all of you. I'm Mukulika Banerjee. I'm director of the South Asia Center at LSE, and gives me great pleasure to also say that this is the first public event the South Asia Center is formally hosting, and we are absolutely delighted that our guest this evening is Ms. Shobhana Bhartia, as you all know. Um, and Shobhana is a very special guest for a number of different reasons, but also because many of us, and the fact that so many of you are here this evening, is testimony to the fact that we all know of you, but haven't had a chance to engage with her in a discussion to get her views on things. And what I'm going to do this evening, therefore, is pose a set of questions to Shobhana, but really let her speak. But just to structure her comments, I'm going to ask the occasional question and then let you roll. But Shobhana, as you all know, is the chairperson and editorial director of the Hindustan Times Group. The Hindustan Times newspaper is one that many, certainly of my generation, know, and even some young people might know from a screen on their computer. You might not know what it looks like in the flesh, so to speak, but is one of the most widely circulated and read newspapers in India. I did look up the figures. It's over 2 million circulation. So it's in the top 6 newspapers in India. It's huge. But your designation, Shobhana, is of the Hindustan Times Group. So can you tell us a little bit, to start with, what the Hindustan Times Group actually consists of? What are the different publications underneath it?
Sure, thanks, Mukulika. I find it a little awkward. I'm sort of off.
Do you want to turn around a bit and
sit?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I think that's better.
Yeah?
Yeah, that's better. The Hindustan Times Group primarily started as a newspaper organization, as a print media group, in the sense responding to the needs pre-independence. This group was started for a certain purpose. But today the Hindustan Times Group actually comprises of 2 listed entities, which is a company that publishes the Hindustan Times, Mint, and also has forayed into radio, internet, and many other areas. Second is again a listed entity, and that's a vernacular entity, and that basically publishes the Hindustan, and a very strong online offering that supports Hindustan. The reason being because we are seeing far greater growth happening in the vernacular space in India. More than 70% of India actually lives in the villages, in the smaller areas. English is not the predominant language used over there. So the kind of growth that you see in vernacular, Hindi being, of course, the predominant vernacular language, but even the other languages, is much more. So to bring about greater focus, we actually spun off our vernacular offering into a separate listed entity, which also in a sense is part of what you just call the Hindustan Times Group. So, and then there are other sort of digital properties that we have, whether it's sites for jobs or whether it's a kind of a 360 marketing solution, because the entire traffic and the greatest threat to newspapers is now the encroachment by the online media, and even an advertiser typically is looking for that solution. So quite apart from what we do in terms of generating content and producing newspapers, we also have something which is called Digital Quotient, which is actually a complete solution for a product, for an advertiser, taking care of his needs in terms of product positioning, in terms of marketing, in terms of a whole digital campaign, print campaign, and trying to help them anecdotally. So these are the various, in a broader sense, these are the various components. Then under all of them, there are other verticals, but that's what really comprises of the Hindustan Times Group that you spoke about.
Okay, so the Hindustan newspaper, which is published in Hindi, how does its circulation figures compare relative to the English one?
Well, the figures of Hindustan, as I just said, vernacular is growing much faster.
So it's a rising circulation.
It's a rising circulation. Even English is a rising circulation. I mean, India is quite an envy of publishers because we are still seeing growth even in English, though when I speak to many other fellow publishers all over the world, it's an industry that's it's a sunset industry. But in India, we are still seeing growth in English, but that's single digit. As far as the vernacular is concerned, it is actually double digit, and it's a more robust industry. The figures are also, we go by what is called readership in India. And therefore, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you as a household get a newspaper, only you would be reading your own unique paper. A newspaper is shared. And therefore, there are different numbers in different states depending on economic parameters. So there are some richer states, and therefore the socio-economic category that you're talking about is actually very different. And then there are other states where a newspaper is read by 4 or 5 people. So the Hindi newspapers, we typically look at a multiple of about 3 or 3.5, whereas for an English newspaper, you look at a smaller multiple, assuming that the person who's purchased an English newspaper, they have the purchasing power to have a paper to service each person who reads it. So to that extent, if you were to look at the readership of the vernacular, I would say it's not only double of English, but it's almost 5 times that of our English group, though the importance in the sense of the voice share that you have is very often disproportionate to the numbers, because English is still the more preferred medium for advertisers and for opinion makers, but actually the numbers stack in favor of vernacular.
Okay. And no other Indian languages, it's just Hindi, isn't it?
No, the other Indian languages also play a very important role in the states whichever they actually cater to. So whether it's the southern papers like the Tamil papers, they do have a very strong voice, but naturally those are all restricted to certain pockets, and Hindi is a much more universal vernacular language. So thereby Hindi papers are more in terms of numbers and influence. But in certain unique states, you do have the local relevant language newspaper actually having far greater weight than the English newspapers
Sure.
do.
Like Manorama and
Malayalam Manorama.
Malayalam.
In fact, that is one of the largest circulated newspapers in the country, more than our English papers are.
Even more than Times of India.
Yes, even more than Times of India. Yes,
Which is extraordinary.
of a single edition.
Yes. Okay.
See, also India is to that extent a very unique country. So it's not like you have a British paper, or it's a little more like the American model where every city has its own paper. So there are very few so-called national papers, because it's just such a diverse country when each state is very unique. Each state has their own priorities and their own needs. So therefore, we have papers that actually cater to particular geographies, and they aren't really national papers. The paper you just named, Times of India, has many more editions than, say, the Malayalam Manorama, and thereby they may have a larger number. But in absolute terms, if you actually look at a single edition paper, I would say that the largest in the country is Malayalam Manorama. And again, that's vernacular. But don't forget, the paper I'm talking about also comes from a state which has 100% literacy.
Yeah.
So therefore, the readership in that state is much more, and it lends itself much more to newspapers having a higher circulation than, say, a state like Bihar, where I have a large market share, but it's one of the most illiterate states.
Yeah. And do you think what has changed in terms of brand loyalty to newspapers? Because earlier households were associated with, and that's certainly true here. You are a Daily Mail reader, or you are a Financial Times kind of person, right? Is there that sense of brand loyalty, which I know growing up in India we certainly had? There were households that were Statesman households or Times of India households or Hindustan Times households. Has that remained, or is that a changing landscape?
Oh, that's a completely changing landscape. I think brand loyalties are becoming extremely weak, because now you get content on the go. I mean, nobody waits to get their particular brand. Sure, you may have the app of your brand if you want to, but even there, with mobile space being crowded out by people downloading so many apps, not necessarily pertaining to news. News is amongst one of the apps that is fighting for space. So people consume news on the go. It doesn't matter what the brand is. It doesn't matter from where it comes. And therefore, brand loyalties are becoming much weaker. And especially in the upper echelons, we feel that it's become very, very weak. But again, going back to vernacular and going back to the smaller towns, brand loyalty counts for a lot. Because there they very firmly believe in the printed word. I would say even more on the printed word than they do, say, for instance, on television or some other medium of sharing content. There, the printed word is the gospel truth, and brand loyalty counts for a lot. But that's only really in the uh, interiors. But the moment you try and move up to the socio-economic category A plus A, which is where a lot of your advertising money comes in from. You see, our products are very heavily subsidized. It's a very different model altogether. So though your readership may come from a different bucket, your advertisers are looking more at your SEC A plus, SEC-B at the most. And that's where there's no brand loyalty. It's actually very, very worrying for us because the brand loyalties have totally collapsed over there. And you need to win that battle constantly, because if you are to make a business case for publishing, that is a very important target because you're totally dependent on ad revenues.
So what is the business model?
The business model is very skewed in favor of ads because it's a very heavily subsidized product. And I still remember that in the 80s, when I actually got involved with the newspaper, we used to all say that the more we circulate, the more we lose. And therefore, we want to draw a line and say, okay, we are not going to take the circulation above 500,000. And we stuck at 500,000 for the longest time because we thought we didn't want to lose more money. And all the revenue actually comes in from the advertisement side. So the higher you circulate, the more is your power to price yourself, and you price yourself upward with as many readers as you add. But even that is no longer that elastic because there are now competing mediums. So a lot of the spend is going on mobiles, a lot of the spend is going on television. Television is now outperforming print, outgrowing print. So therefore, now in this very competitive landscape, your ability to actually price up your product is somewhat limited. But the revenues are coming totally from advertising. Again, the vernacular model changes and the English model is different. But in the English model, the prices are ridiculously low.
Yeah.
They don't even meet the cost of your raw material. Forget actually meeting the cost of bringing out the product, the wages, the salaries, your overheads, nothing, not even the raw material.
So what would happen if you double the price of a newspaper?
You'll drop. It's very price sensitive. You'll drop numbers. And if you drop numbers, then your main source of revenue, which is ad revenue, goes down. And competition is very intense as well. And as I told you, that brand loyalty doesn't really matter for much any longer. They'll buy another paper, yeah. And the moment you try and do it collectively, it's cartelization. We have a very strong competition commission, which incidentally is housed in the Hindustan Times building.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So you can't do that any longer. You can't be talking to your competitors, and you can't any longer have that conversation that let's all take up our prices. Doesn't work that way.
Can you tell us a bit more about this cartelization? Anti-cartelization, presumably, office in the Hindustan Times. That's very interesting.
Yeah, well, it's the equivalent of your trade practices and all that you have in any other country. So the Competition Commission, I mean, it's quite a recent development in India. I would say it's been there for all of 8 to 10 years.
Okay.
In the sense of being functional. I'm sure it was there even before, but now it is very sort of dynamic, and they do keep looking for trends in every industry in terms of companies coming together and trying to drive consumer behavior by using the joint cloud. So whether it's telecom or whether it's media or any other industry.
What's it called?
The Competition Commission of India, CCI.
Okay. That's interesting because
and
it's the regulatory framework in India for institutions. It's not one that we hear about and talk about enough.
No, so really. It is a relatively newer development. I would say it's been active only for the last 7-8 years, really, in every sense of the word. Of course, I'm sure it existed in some form before that as well.
And where do its powers come from? Is it an industry-led commission or
government.
is it government?
It's government.
So it's headed by a civil servant.
Constitutional validity, absolutely.
Oh, okay.
It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be. So very often it's headed by a retired person. It doesn't have to be headed by a civil servant. You can get a technocrat in as well.
Okay.
Yes.
Interesting. Yeah. That's fair. By the way, Shobhana mentioned the Hindustan Times House. For those of you who haven't been in Delhi, it's a completely iconic building in the middle of Connaught Place in Delhi. You can't miss it. And like you say, and I think we have people from the BBC here or ex-BBC. I think BBC studios are in the top floor, aren't they, in your building? Okay, so this is sort of brings me. You said you started in the 80s in the Hindustan Times Group, working in it, and you were incredibly young. You weren't even 30, and you were there really because your father. This was one of his interests, right, as part of the Birla group. What was that like? there are lots of people here, there are lots of young people here who might be imagining futures in media. Um, what was it like to be a young woman in India in the 1980s from the family of the owners, really, of the newspaper, to come into that scenario with a genuine interest in journalism, which is what you had? Yeah.
Yeah, well, actually, it will be misleading for anyone who has any interest in the media because the situation's totally changed in India, and therefore it's not at all uncommon now for women to want to venture out and work, whether it's in the
Sure.
media or whether it's in
Sure.
any other field. So it's not what it was when I actually started working. And I also came from a bit of a conservative background. All of India was pretty conservative. Having said that, I have to say that I am on several international media bodies, whether it's the Commonwealth Press Union or International Press Institute, and the number of women who are actually there holding senior positions, you can count them on your fingertips. So to that extent, it's not like
Yeah.
India is very different to what's happening all over. I mean, I find there are very few women, period. But India those days and the community that I came from was slightly more conservative than even many others. And therefore, it was kind of frowned upon that, one wanted to get out and work, and that also in the media space. It was a male bastion. There were very few women, and definitely not holding high positions. And it was a very challenging place to be in because you could get in there, you could get a foot in because you happened to be the promoter's daughter. But to actually be empowered or to command any kind of respect or authority was something that you had to earn. And with the mindset being what it was, and with people believing that if a male heir ever stepped in, obviously he was there to carry forward the business. But if a woman came in, maybe it's a pastime and maybe you get bored and you'll move out. And therefore you're not taken seriously enough for the first many years. So it was very challenging, but that's not to say that's a situation today. If any other young woman were to actually enter in any other so-called male bastion, India has come a long way since then.
Sure.
So though it was very challenging, but we aren't in the same environment anymore.
No, but I think what you say about male heirs being the natural inheritors of the family business is very much, I mean, what was the film that was recently, Zoya Akhtar's new film, Dil Dhadakne Do, this was exactly the sibling. The daughter was business savvy, she was interested, she was capable, but it was unthinkable. Father and the son wasn't at all interested, but it was, and that resonated because I think that is today's film. I mean, that's a film in 2015, and that thinking was very different. So, what is it that did you have to ask your father, or did he ask you to join, or what? And you grew up in Kolkata, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
So what had brought you to Delhi, and how did that happen?
Well, my husband actually moved to Delhi for business purposes, and that's why I moved as well. And I was always very interested in sort of public life. I was a voracious reader. I would read all the papers, and when I moved to Delhi, I could follow Hindustan Times more closely than sitting in Calcutta. So I would quite often tell my father that we've missed the story or we haven't reported this correctly, only because I had nothing better to do, and I would read up all the 6-7 papers that there were. And so he finally thought that if I had an aptitude for it, that it might be a good idea for me to start taking some interest. So it was at a very informal level, by actually being associated only with the Sunday magazine section of the paper for a couple of years to just whet my appetite and see whether I had the staying power or not. And
in those days, Sunday magazines just did fashion and food.
No, they did not. They do fashion
Okay.
and food now.
Oh, I see. Okay, sorry.
They
So what
only
did you
had
do in those
politics.
days?
Yeah.
So they had
they had
longer features.
Yeah,
and
longer
so.
features. They were heavy. They were political.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he
They were
gave you a
quite
meaty
different.
job then.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but nonetheless limited to the Sunday section of the magazine section of the Sunday paper.
Okay.
So it was limited to that.
And Hindustan Times House was where it was even then?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
Yes.
So and your husband didn't have a problem with this, obviously?
No, he didn't. No.
Just
He's
as
been a
well.
great
Yeah.
support, yes.
And what about the other women in the family? How did they see this? You have a sister?
I do,
Yeah.
but I don't think they were really very interested in this particular field or in working at that moment. I think they were all busy with the families, so I don't think that was an issue at all.
Okay. So, but in Calcutta, I remember you saying sometime, of course, the newspaper there was the Statesman, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, we grew up reading the Statesman, and it was like the final word, and people would read the Statesman if they wanted to improve their language. That's the way newspapers were edited once upon a time. And but that's changed. Statesman has totally crumbled as an organization.
Has it?
Yeah,
Really?
it has.
Even though they have that magnificent building in
They
Delhi.
they do but that's about it now. Yeah.
And then, so you stayed with the newspaper for a long time, working your way through it, and then went abroad and worked in newspaper offices at the Washington Post and so on.
No, not really. No, I didn't really go and work in the
Yeah,
Washington
but you
Post.
went.
But yeah, I did. I did immediately after sort of getting into the newspaper and finding my feet. I thought I would want to benchmark the paper or learn from the best. And for me, the best was not another competitor from India. So I decided to go out to Washington. And I actually fixed an appointment with K. Graham, who was then heading the Washington Post, and I was still in my late 20s. And I still remember when I was going up the elevator, there was much trepidation, and I thought to myself, why have I come here? You know, maybe I shouldn't have asked for this appointment, because suddenly you develop cold feet.
Yeah.
And I have to say that she was extremely endearing as a person, very, very. Being a woman, I think somewhere she sort of understood where one was coming from. We've had similar backgrounds in terms of getting into the media. And then I spent about 10 days, and she put me in different departments, trying to understand marketing, because it was a concept that was very new for India. We had just a straight dividing line, so it was circulation and advertisement. There was nothing called marketing. There was no concept called marketing. And there was no concept about brand loyalty, because you didn't need brand loyalty. There was no competition, and therefore every brand had their own position. And so there was no concept of actually creating that department, whereas all our other papers and papers in the West always had very strong brand divisions, marketing departments. So I wanted to go and understand and learn that, understand how to set it up. I also spent time then with the editorial there, because that's where my passion was, and Ben Bradley was the editor. So Mrs. Graham told me, okay, you'll go and sit in every evening meeting, but mum's the word. You're not going to go out and talk about anything that you've heard, because those days everything would get translated into page one the next day. It wasn't like, Washington Post either had a very dynamic website where all the news would come. Everyone would guard their stories, wait for their bylines to appear the next morning. So I spent about a week, 10 days in different departments, trying to understand best practices, trying to institutionalize the working at HT from being very ad hoc to being more process-led. So therefore, it should be something that I felt would make each one of us very redundant, as opposed to being totally dependent on a individual. And we had in the 80s or in the 70s editors who were larger than life. And the entire profile of the newspaper only depended on an individual.
That's true.
And that was something that was scary to me. And it had started changing in the West, but it hadn't changed in India. And we had stalwarts, and therefore there was a lot of clout and a certain position that they were, certain pedestal they were put on. But at the end of the day, a brand couldn't be hostage to just an individual. And therefore there were lots of processes that I wanted to understand. So I spent a lot of time, and actually that was the starting of a very deep engagement and a personal bond with Mrs. Graham and the Washington Post, because after that we constantly kept in touch, and the current newspaper that you see is largely the efforts of the design team at the Washington Post, who came and spent 6-7 months with us and designed and formatted the paper. So that relationship actually translated into a very long-term engagement between both the newspaper groups. And even when I had to look for an editor and I was trying to look for talent to start a financial daily, I got a lot of help from the Washington Post. That was before it got sold. It was still with the Grahams then.
Okay.
So that was the starting of a very long and a very fruitful relationship.
So what made you want to start Mint?
Well, it was an obvious thing to do, because we didn't have a financial offering, and therefore naturally the readers of our paper, if they wanted to have more sort of in-depth financial news, would have to go to a different brand. So it was an obvious thing to do, to start a financial paper. But the point is that you already had one very well-entrenched paper which had large numbers, and then you had 3 or 4 other titles. And a financial newspaper is still a niche product. It's not like a general interest mass newspaper. So the challenge really was that what kind of a product do you launch? And what is going to be your differentiator? And how do you cut through the clutter in terms of being noticed and stand apart? because you could be a Me Too, then you're going to be, competing for the longest time to actually make a success of what you're doing because you have a market leader who had the numbers. So the whole challenge was to come out with a proposition that was a little different, that was a little unique, and that would help us cut through the clutter. And that's why we came in with what we call the Birla concept, which is really a different size and a shape. So it's very distinct to the existing broadsheet paper that was there. So it was a different shape, a different size, and then we decided to go in for a more niche product, and we decided to see what were the kind of what were the challenges or what were the unfulfilled needs of those who actually read a pink paper. And we found that in-depth journalism was one such area. And also, as our economic reform started in the early 80s, and you saw a new generation of Indians who were now engaged and who were aspirational, we realized that it's no longer just an industry person or somebody who's in the corporate sector who felt the need for a financial paper. And therefore, we thought that it's important to try and have a newspaper that actually comes out with clarity on economic issues, but socio-economic issues and how they impact you or our lives. So people had more disposable incomes to invest. They wanted better understanding about the markets. They wanted more information on commodities. So it was a new India that we were dealing with post the changes that happened in 1980s. And there was a new consumer class that was created actually. So to try and fill in those gaps, we decided to do some research, put together what we thought was a product profile, and then we launched Mint as a differentiator, not competing with the leading economic or financial paper then, so not really looking at the large numbers. We are, however, the number 2 in terms of economic papers in India, but there is a gap between us and the leading paper because our profiles are different and the product offering is different, and it's meant to be different.
But it's carved out its own niche. It's a very distinctive space.
It is very
isn't
distinctive,
it?
yes.
But you're absolutely right. I hadn't thought about it, that the need to almost understand financial language it became almost a responsibility of the press to provide it in a sort of educative fashion for this new, to talk about investments. Earlier, apart from life insurance or a couple of other known things, there were no other vehicles in which you could invest your money.
Because suddenly you saw the emergence of a whole new middle class, a lot of consumerism, because when the trade barriers came down and then the Narasimha Rao government actually changed the entire landscape, you suddenly saw the emergence of a lot of new businesses, small businesses, people with disposable incomes, and they wanted answers.
Also, I don't know how old it is in the UK, for instance, but to end every bulletin with stock market figures, is now, it's become completely routine on Indian television and newspapers to get that information. I don't ever remember that being available so readily.
You're absolutely right.
Which sort of marks that shift, doesn't it? So let's talk a little bit about your political career then, which, of course, Shobhana was nominated as Rajya Sabha MP. Tell us give us an insider's view of the Rajya Sabha. It's not often we get to hear this, but as much as you can tell us, but it will be really interesting to hear what that was like.
Coming from the outside, and especially coming from the publishing industry, there was a certain amount of disdain that we had for the way Parliament was conducted, if I may say so, for parliamentarians as well. When I was like sort of a cub reporter, I remember spending hours and hours in the press gallery, following important debates, sitting up till 2, 3 a.m. in the morning sometimes because of the voting happening late. And one always felt that, here were these unruly bunch of people, and somehow they don't come out with the same sort of suaveness that perhaps people in the media might have. And so I went in, I was very sort of honored, and I felt privileged for having been nominated. But I wasn't quite sure as to how regular I was going to be. I was quite clear that I would go every day because having accepted it, I think you ought to make that effort. But I wasn't quite sure how much time I would spend, and I went in with a slight air of, God alone knows whether, this group actually would let work progress, what they would do. But I have to tell you that being in Parliament was a huge leveler. It was a huge leveler because you're meeting all kinds of people from very diverse and different backgrounds. They may have a very different sort of way of conducting business to perhaps what the media would want and demand. So, the two caps you wear, you go back and you write editorials and you're saying all kinds of things about there being more order, about things being conducted in a different way. But the kind of depth of knowledge that a lot of these parliamentarians have, more so because they come straight from the grassroots, they have first-hand experience of what's happening. They have a huge wealth of information, and you suddenly start realizing that you have a lot of respect for that. And therefore it was a very humbling experience, because you find yourself to be very inadequate very often in areas which really matter. So, we pick up certain areas in the media, and very often this charge is made and flung at us that, sitting and having a 30,000 view to issues really doesn't solve the issues. You aren't up close, you aren't down there, you aren't dirtying your hands, you aren't getting in the midst of what's happening. And you do find that in Parliament, when you actually meet with these people with first-hand experience, coming and narrating stories, participating in debates, but very often not that, even just, the conversations that would happen and the anecdotes that they would actually bring was quite a kind of a, for me, it was quite a bit of a game changer.
Oh, that's really
Yes.
interesting. I mean,
And I found myself sometimes going back to work and wanting to take up issues, or wanting the paper to take up a campaign on issues that otherwise would never have occurred or struck me. Because, sitting in cities and towns, we actually target just a certain audience where our readership is. But our readership may be more interested, or maybe a different audience, but 70% of India doesn't live there. It lives elsewhere. They have different challenges, and there are different opportunities that they demand. And actually, we don't have the audiences who want to get too engaged with that. And therefore, you tailor make your product to suit your readership, which is fine. But it's just that you may do that on a more ongoing basis, but yet occasionally you do have to look at some other issues as well. And so a lot of these sort of issues would come up, issues about gender equality, issues about what was happening at the village level in terms of gender issues. And you do start feeling more strongly and passionately about a lot of the issues. And HT may not have been the necessary medium for me to have actually taken up a lot of this, but Hindustan definitely was, because the readership is very different, the profiles are very different.
and were you able to affect that change or
I,
bring
I
those
was,
outcomes?
I was. There were many issues which very often fellow parliamentarians would bring to my attention, and we would sit and discuss what's happening. And very often I would go back and get the local paper to actually take it up, to do a deep dive into that issue, to try and analyze that issue, and very often advocate that issue. At the end of the day, the paper's role has to be one of advocacy as well. And you can actually implement that more effectively in smaller towns and through the vernacular than you can in English,
Sure.
because there's less cynicism. And so there was a lot of advocacy that we did for issues at different points through the vernacular paper.
What you say is so interesting, because when you think of people being nominated to the upper house of any parliament here or in India, it's really because, and quite rightly, they're bringing their expertise or knowledge in their field to parliament. And what you're describing is the reverse flow of what parliament can
Sure.
offer back to these
Yeah,
fields.
yeah.
So we would like Sachin Tendulkar, for instance, to come to parliament occasionally, but also to go back and talk about how cricket
Yeah.
politics is managed in India, which is abysmal, as we know. But we need to, so that reverse. So where did these conversations happen? I mean, was it in the canteen, or was there collision space? Were there social occasions?
Yeah, well, social occasions as well, because there are enough events for parliamentarians where all parliamentarians are called, so you interact with each other, you meet over a cup of tea. But you're also sitting and talking to each other in the house very often. When an important debate is going on, you have others explaining what it actually means, and you just hear them through their participation in parliament,
Of course,
which
yeah.
you're compelled to do when you're actually a member of parliament. You
Yeah.
can still watch them on television, but few people have the time or the interest to actually do that. But when you're sitting there, you're compelled to sit through several debates, you're waiting there for voting, you actually hear a cross section on a given topic.
Yeah.
which
Well,
was very educative.
yeah, that's really that's genuinely, I mean, new. I haven't heard that before. But given that scenario and given where the Rajya Sabha is today, right, and what is happening with legislative work in Parliament being constantly stalled and these wasted sessions, one session after the other, where simply things can't pass because of the impasse with the Rajya Sabha and the government and so on. What do you make of this current scenario, and do you see a way out of it?
It's actually really unfortunate what's happening, because just when you feel that India is really poised to take off, our economy has been performing better than many other countries. We have a demographic dividend. We have the skill set, though not as much as we would like to, and yet legislation does not happen because of Parliament not allowing it to happen. It is very frustrating. But unfortunately, the nature of politics, and I've been closely observing politics for at least 25 years or more, and I haven't found as much acrimony as I see today ever that I can remember. It's become extremely personalized, it's become very acrimonious, and you oppose for the sake of opposing. It's no longer opposing something because you don't support a particular legislation. It could be the very same legislation that you espoused when you were in power, but today you want to block it. And actually, this started, I would say, not only during the current government's time. I think one saw this uh, for the last 5 or 6 years, where politics turned very, very personal, very bitter, in an unhealthy manner. I still remember the days when Indira Gandhi was a prime minister and Pilu Modi was a very articulate, bitter critic in parliament, and they would spar in parliament. But she would call him home for tea, they would sit over a cup of tea, there was a certain civil behavior. We don't see that in politics any longer, and that's really unfortunate, because at the end of the day, there needs to be a certain alignment in terms of national interest and nation building. But politics has become so personal that legislation's actually been held hostage to that. And I don't know what the way forward is going to be. We keep going from session to session, hoping that there's going to be some thaw. Yeah. And you see some forward movement, because we've had a whole slew of legislations that have been held up, which could have potentially actually transformed our economy over the next 6-8 months if they had gone through. And these are all wasted opportunities, but that's the nature of bitterness that's actually now, that marks our political discourse.
Yeah. Talking of political discourse, especially in the last few months, there seems to be, on the one hand, a great optimism, like you said, of India being on the verge of taking flight and shining ultimately. And on the other hand, a real worry about the growth of intolerance in public life, right? How do you see this developing from here?
It is
it's a real worry, isn't it?
It's a real worry. It's very disconcerting. On the one hand, we feel that we have just so many opportunities that are in our favor. But on the other hand, you have the entire narrative getting sort of overtaken by other kind of incidents that are playing out, creating divides in society, lack of tolerance, lack of responses to such occurrences. And the entire narrative, even internationally, on the one hand, we have a prime minister who's actually doing a very hard sell and doing quite a decent job of it, going from nation to nation, country to country. People are looking at India with some sort of renewed interest of being a place of great opportunity. But on the other hand, when you actually have the kind of instances that we have seen in the last couple of years playing out, and even though we may say that these are all fringe elements, but these fringe elements are not being reined in, and there are no sort of comments on what's happening, it's actually sending very conflicting signals to the international community as well. Yeah. So on the one hand, you're wooing everyone, and you're trying to get people to look at India differently, to look at India as a land of opportunity. But on the other hand, if you look at the fault lines that have suddenly emerged, every other day, I've been in London now for the last 5-6 days, but every day I actually see a new instance coming up.
Yeah.
Again, this growing intolerance, which is actually very worrying.
It is very worrying, and it's actually showing what, social scientists, those of us who think about Indian society quite deeply, always knew, that there is a deep violence at the core of Indian social life. Whether you think of, you keep the 70% who live in villages, or you think of the population of Dalits, or our huge numbers of displaced populations of indigenous people, it's been a very violent record on the one hand of, and now, in a sense, yes, it's surprising, and there been such a huge escalation of intolerance, of utterances, of gestures, of people taking umbrage at the slight. And I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on this, because as a paper, at least, you've very consistently kept centrist secular line, right? As a policy. And what is developing now is precisely a threat to that. So how do you respond to that as opinion makers?
Well, I think the response of the opinion makers cutting across media groups has definitely been in terms of condemning what is happening. The fault lines are there because it's a very unequal society in India.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why, unlike many other nations, India has to have a more inclusive growth. And we have had a more inclusive growth, and therefore the economic parameters very often have been frowned upon by many other developing countries that want India not to have so many subsidies and all. But it's a very unequal society, and therefore perhaps in the short term it's a must. But I don't totally agree with you that there is a lot of pent-up anger. Yes, there is a lot of disquiet, and there is frustration, and there are divides. But very often these are played upon, I believe, as a publisher, by interest groups in order to actually polarize sections of society. Because wherever you've seen these kind of uprisings, there has been some political affiliation.
Sure.
And even if I were to say that there's been no political affiliation, why is condemnation not coming in a more upfront manner, in a more immediate manner, in a more firm manner?
Yes.
Why is there just such a stony silence as a reaction to so many, whether it's saying that you can't have beef, or whether it's saying that somebody cannot perform in a city, or you can't have a book release in a city because the person who's the author of the book has written against India. So every single day there are these kind of instances, but I don't hear a strong response being critical of them.
Yeah.
And especially in this day and age when, people are sort of reacting to events on the go. Even before you finish a sentence, there's opinion on Twitter. So you no longer have to wait for the print media to come and interview you and to give a response.
Yeah, yeah.
So the lack of response is actually what is bothering us in the media.
Yeah.
It's, one is the incident itself, where very often there are reasons why it's happening. Very often, perhaps something has led to it. But on the other hand, the lack of response is even more worrisome.
And that's a very stark difference between, say, how the political establishment and the media work here and, say, in India. I've never failed to be both astonished and thrilled at the roasting that the Prime Minister of a country or the Chancellor can get in a studio, right? Whether it's on television, whether it's on radio, it routinely happens. In a sense, and which is not to say it is all without flaws, but this certainly happens. We can't even begin to imagine that scenario, can we? Where the Prime Minister of a country feels like our current Prime Minister or previous Prime Ministers who also have been very silent are expected to respond to the press. And that's what the press is there for, to hold them to account on behalf of the listening population. And do you think that might ever change?
Well, yeah, I hope it would change, and it is changing. I think it also depends on, different governments, and each one's response and level of accountability also sort of varies. Currently, this current government at the moment does not really seem to be wanting to engage with the media very much.
At all. We
At
only
all.
talked at. We are not, I mean, that's the point, that we have to listen. We can't ask.
Yeah, because then you aren't asked uncomfortable questions.
Yeah.
So, but equally, the Prime Minister, for instance, has gone through endless number of television interviews before he became Prime Minister, and to that extent was open and accountable, and did go through the same grilling that you're talking about. So it's not like that level of journalism is not there, or that politicians feel that they're not answerable. I think what happens is sometimes, when you have absolute power,
Yes.
you feel totally secure in that, and you feel you don't need the media. You don't need the messenger, because you'll get your message out nonetheless. It'll be on your blog, you'll get it out through the social media.
Yeah.
And why should you answer uncomfortable questions?
Yeah. Only no democratic government ever has absolute power, do they? I mean,
No,
they're
they
only there
don't.
for.
But
for
you go
thank
through
goodness.
phases when,
Yeah,
and that
yeah,
seems
no,
to be
I-
the phase, but I'm sure the phase would change.
Yeah.
And it was different even earlier. And the very same state actors today were very answerable 2 years ago. And I'm sure will be answerable going forward.
Yeah.
But sure, the phase that we are going through just now, maybe it's still the honeymoon period. We've just been a year and a half into a new government.
Long
And at the
honeymoon.
moment, the engagement with the media is totally not there.
No,
We
no.
aren't taken on foreign trips. We aren't given
Oh, that's true.
interviews.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, right to information is slowly seeing a natural death.
There's been a
Yes.
lot of
Oh,
recent
yes.
writing
Oh,
about
yes.
that. Yeah. Now,
We used to
I'm-
use it as a main tool for breaking news,
Mm.
and now we don't get responses. It gets rejected all the time.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So if you sent a question to PMO, and
Oh no.
you wouldn't.
You won't get an answer.
And from ministries?
You rarely get an answer. Most of them are getting rejected. So that's been one grudge of the media, that RTI is becoming quite defunct, and that was like a lifeline for us. At least for those journalists who wanted to move beyond lazy journalism.
Sure.
It was a very
But
powerful tool.
But have you been making a stink about this?
Oh yes, yes.
That,
Yes.
Yeah, that, okay.
Yeah.
Because I read a couple of editorials just
Yes.
yesterday actually about RTI, Aruna Roy just saying that RTI needs
Yeah.
a second lease of
Sure.
life and so on. Now, I'm conscious that a lot of people will have questions, and we'll open it up if that's
Yeah,
okay too.
absolutely.
There are several other questions I would like to ask, but I'm sure they'll come up, and if they don't, I'll ask them while you're thinking. So should we take a few questions? There's stewards with microphones, and I think we have a gentleman there in the corner. Can I request everybody to keep your questions short and to definitely ask a question? If you make a comment, I will cut you off. Stewards are under strict instructions to take your microphone away. So please ask a question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question in relation to what you said about how India is sending a mixed signal to the international investment community. A few years ago, you had Formula One going into India. I don't think it did too well, for whatever reason. I hope you can enlighten me, because we have a brand, myself, and we have an air show. We have done it in 16 countries around the world. We have 60 TV stations all over the world covering this event. We want to bring it to India, but we have our reservations based upon what happened to Bernie Ecclestone with Formula One. And I just want to know, from your point of view, should foreigners like ourselves bring luxury items to India, and what could be the challenges ahead for us? Thank you.
Suhail should have been here as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's a very niche market for luxury items, a very, very small section of our population, but that section per se in actual numbers is still large enough. And that's the reason why we had Formula One coming to India, and why we have other niche events wanting to come, because even though it's a very small percentage, it's still large in absolute terms. But I still think the Indian market hasn't really matured enough beyond certain sports. It is opening up a lot now, but I think the call would really be yours, whether you would want to have a much larger participation in terms of the Indian audiences. For Formula One, the inconveniences and the organizing was also much criticized by the press. So I'm not so sure whether it was because Indians are not ready, because it's a chicken and egg situation. Very often, you need to expose them to certain events, and you need to be incubating those events for people and to whet their appetite. And you do have a first mover advantage if you were to do that. So Formula One, I think, also had other issues. But again, as I said, you'll have a very small section, I think, that would be interested, but that small section may also be large enough numbers.
Do you have a local partner in India
For?
for like Formula One?
Yes, they did. They had actually one of the largest telecom companies who partnered them.
And the problem was with the telecoms company not performing to the letter, or?
Well, I wouldn't know that quite honestly, because I think they worked as a team, so I really don't know where the fault was, but it wasn't really very well organized. And there was a lot of criticism that they met with. They did it actually for 3 years and then.
Okay, I think there's Andrew in the middle there. Andrew Whitehead from BBC. He's asking the next question.
Thank you. I wonder if I could push you a little bit about being a person with commanding editorial authority in one of the main Indian media groups, and at the same time, for a period, a member of the Indian Parliament. You talked about the role of the news media in holding politicians and those in positions of authority in public life to account. Indeed, that's probably their main public purpose. But to do that well, I wonder whether there needs to be a distance between the news media and politicians and people in Parliament in particular, and whether indeed there needs to be something more than that. There needs to be a certain level of institutional distrust, which you certainly largely have here, and you could say that's one of the strengths of the British media scene. And by blurring that line to some extent, I wonder, do you feel that you've in any way constrained the ability of the news media to hold politicians to account?
That's a moot question, and that's a question that has been asked by many people. There is a difference. We do have many publishers actually who are members of Parliament. I personally feel there is a conflict of interest. I was one of the nominated members of Parliament, so I did not belong to a political party, and the whip also did not apply to me. And there have been instances in my 6 years of Parliament where I have voted with different parties at different times, and in fact voted against the ruling party on several occasions and voted for the ruling party. So no whip applied, but equally there are many publishers, especially the regional publishers, who are members of Parliament and who do belong to political parties. And there is that conflict there, because then the paper can't toe any line but the line of that party. Also, our entire regulatory architecture is very vulnerable to government pressure, which doesn't sort of give us the vibrancy that we need in the media. So whether it's broadcasting licenses, whether it's government advertising, which all regional papers are totally dependent on, or whether it's FDI rules, they're all controlled by the government. So unfortunately, our regulatory architecture does leave the media quite vulnerable. And then when you have people belonging to a political party, then what you're saying is absolutely correct. The only thing I can say to that extent is that I was fortunately not a member of any political party. You have the option of joining a political party within 6 months of being nominated. Some of my other fellow colleagues did do that. They did join a political party and then become a member of that party. You have more longevity because then you can keep getting elected to Parliament time and again. I opted not to because for me, my newspaper was a much larger entity. But equally, there are many regional promoters of newspapers that have many other varied interests, and therefore they do not mind joining political parties. They do join them. But I guess then people also understand that if you belong to a certain party, that is, say, the ruling party in a state like Uttar Pradesh, the readers have enough options today to either reject you or to accept you. It's not the sort of endorsement that you have in the US where you sort of espouse whether you're, endorsing the Republicans or the Democrats with the valid reasons, but you are in a sense sort of saying that, yes, I do support this ideology, and therefore your readers do take whatever you write with a pinch of salt, or they choose to continue reading you or buying your product because there's so much of competition, and as I said earlier, there is no brand loyalty. And in fact, it was something that was quite sort of an area of concern for me, that I hope my brand doesn't get impacted. And honestly speaking, if I had to join a political party, I don't think I would have done it because the paper is a large entity. But on the other hand, there are enough people who have fringe papers or who have smaller papers, and the disproportionate sort of clout that they get for other businesses perhaps compensates them. It's not an ideal situation. It's not something that I think actually lends to free or fair journalism, but it's there. It is there. I mean, there were 3 or 4 colleagues with quite decent-sized newspapers when I was in Parliament, belonging to political parties, to both the Congress and the BJP. Yes.
Who shall remain unnamed? Or
No, it's very, no, they're all listed entities. The
Yeah.
Jagran group is the largest group in UP.
Yeah.
And the promoter of Jagran was a member of the Samajwadi Party. Then one of the largest newspapers in the vernacular language in Maharashtra was again a member of the Congress Party. So they were all members of political parties, and they were, and the largest paper in Orissa, Satpati, they were also. So there are enough, there are enough publishers who are actually members of political parties. But then again, they have other interests, and I guess somewhere it's fine, but otherwise I do agree with you.
Yeah. Okay, there's a question here in the 3 in a, yeah. You had your hands
Thank you.
up. But,
I have a question regarding the lack of response you mentioned. So I was in India over the summer, and I think during my time there, what I started to realize with some of the political issues you mentioned, such as the beef ban, was that it started to become a mocking matter, sort of taking away the actual seriousness. So given the position of a media platform as an actual sort of opinion maker that I think helps people in the market think about and form their opinion, how do you think you have or can use Hindustan Times to fuel that response and sort of actually look at the seriousness that lies in what is going on at the moment?
Well, I think that's the difference between different brands, and that's where the pulling power of a brand comes in. So it depends how you want to treat an issue. So you do have the tabloid kind of press that actually sensationalizes the issue or doesn't really deal with the cultural sensitivity that an issue perhaps might demand. And that's where I would assume that responsible brands would have a very different kind of a response to the issue. Also in today's day and age, we can't any longer comment on issues or sort of have a narrative without getting the reader response, because the entire online army makes sure that you know. And if you don't engage with your readers, well, there's a kind of it fuels a whole downhill spiral for you. So I think responsible brands have to live up to the faith that's reposed by their readers. Otherwise, you are more than told, and you know where you stand with all the social media. I mean, the kind of abuses you get if you've swayed, I mean, depends which way you want to see it, whether it's, trolls, sort of who you want to ignore, or is it, in a sense, some kind of a check on your standards, crowdsourced check on the standards and what you've written. So I think you don't have one uniform response, but I think that's where the value of the brand comes in. I mean, you read something in a tabloid and it's a smart, and if the same thing is covered by the New York Times, you'll say it's investigative journalism, and that's the power of the brand. And I think that's what's important. So I think it's as important for brands to be able to maintain that and to retain the brand identity. So yes, issues are dealt with in a very flippant way, a lot by many sort of fly-by-night sites that also come up. But I think for an established brand, so whether it's the Hindustan Times or whether it's many other competitors, I think the gravitas with which you actually approach the issue is what matters in the end.
I think, if I got the sense of the question, it was whether if you thought that this was in fact an extremely dangerous trend or a ridiculous ban, whether you as a newspaper would come out and actually say
But
it
every
in so
paper
many-
did. I can't think of any national paper that did not. Of course they did.
Yeah.
I mean, to that extent, Indian papers are very sort of
Robust.
very robust, yes. And I can't think of a single paper that didn't.
Okay.
Yeah, of course they did.
There's a gentleman. Now there's several hands up. I've seen. Okay, I'll tell you what I've seen, so you don't get anxious. This 1, and then 2, and then 3. Yeah, you. No, not you. 3, and then 4, 5, and then 6. Okay. So keep them short because we're going to run out of time. But we have time. It's okay. But keep your questions short.
I
and we'll
think
keep the answers long.
one can see the difference between the leaders here in United States or India, a person who is got funny foibles about the beef ban or Hindutva or, you see, no wonder, you see, if there is anything like issues of Islamophobia here in this, immediately the Cameron comes out, you see, or in Obama in the gun control or the color situation. The leader should give lead, and I don't think because he has come on the crest of the election, he carries on the same foibles which he had before about the beef ban and about the, and I think this will create a hell of a lot of problem, and I think it will give a very bad publicity abroad, saying that he is more inclined, more communal. You see, the whole...
Thank you. No, you've said, you made a comment. Do you have a question?
Yes.
What is your question?
Question is that you are very mealy-mouthed. You are not able to criticize. You just mentioned about the difficulty about the in Parliament and this difficulty of the argy-bargy going on. And I don't think the newspapers are not that brave enough to criticize.
Thank you. I think we'll just take that as a comment and move that to a question queue in the, yeah. You have a question?
Just building upon what was already spoken, with the recent sort of the cases like the Srinagar murder case, etc., I was just wondering if you think, we already touched upon accountability, but do you think with the aim of sort of getting that kind of readership and that kind of TRP, that the entire, like the essence of media as an instrument of accountability for the government is sort of being lost in a way? Because for lack of a better word, the entire sort of issue was sensationalized. And so what would you sort of say would be your take on the role of the media, especially in this case?
In Sheena Bora's case.
You know, in Sheena Bora's case was yet another example of like a soap opera being played out. I wouldn't entirely blame the media for that. I think one has to look at, you know, different sections and the role that they're supposed to play. So for instance, yes, for the media, it did become like a soap opera playing out, and it's become a TRP game. And each channel wants to see how best they can get more TRPs. But it's also a question of the media being fed with stories. I mean, nowhere in the world do you see the police leaking the way they do in India. And that's something that we in the media have also been critical of in editorials through columnists, that the police has no business actually leaking out stuff unless, you know, they should reach the end of the investigation, and then whatever is the conclusion should be shared. Because it actually, in a sense, impacts the case as it were. It's happened in many other cases in the past, and this half-baked information goes out. The media does lap it up because I think the media's ability to be able to sift through what is accurate and what is being fed isn't perhaps as mature as it ought to be. I personally do feel that our television channels have a long way to go before we can sort of come up to the level of international journalism, but somehow it seems to sell. Every morning when I wake up, the first channel I go to is BBC because it gives me a world view of what's happening. And I often wonder, why can't we have the same kind of sanity in the channels back home, where it's like, you know, 6 or 7 different little boxes and each one shouting. And if I'm alone at home and I have nothing to do and I feel I need company, I put it on, because you almost feel you're sitting in a party, but otherwise there's no takeaway. So I still think that our electronic media is very young, needs to go through a lot of maturity. Sadly, what's happening is that they are setting the agenda. And very often you see even the print following that agenda. I won't forget, I had one heated argument once when the little boy fell into a well. And this carried on like a soap opera for 2 or 3 days. And with all due respect and empathy for the little boy, I felt there were other issues. And I remember having this evening meeting, because I take evening meetings for the next day's edition. And I said, no, I think it's really something that we all sympathize with, but I think it can move down the page. I think we can write about what happened to this boy Bablu who fell into a well under the fold, and it was immediately met with a lot of resistance. No, but this is playing out the whole day. And so for 3-4 days, every newspaper, including ours, constantly, you know, the agenda is set, and it has become a bit of a TRP game. But then I believe you get what you deserve. If enough people are watching, are interested, are endorsing, the sort of journalism that very often one is actually exposed to, then maybe that's what we deserve at this moment. But if you do actually compare what's happening globally and you see television back, you can see Indian newspapers, at least in terms of journalism, long format journalism, content, being more or less at par. But I don't see that happening in the electronic media at this point. Maybe because it's so fragmented, and maybe because everyone's fighting for that little share. But I think we have a long way to go. Some who try to strike it out differently actually had miserable TRPs.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll take the question here in the second row, and then we'll take your question, and then we'll come back to, okay. And
Often what we are seeing is this social media, which, as we still know, Twitter is still restricted to probably 1 or 2% of the population. So basically Twitter trends dictating or determining headlines. So do you see this as a dangerous trend? Related to that is the question of, as you talked about, how vernacular media is the one which is dominant in the country and how the space of English media is much limited. Then why do Arnab Goswami, Rajdeep Sardesai and Barkha Dutt matter, and why not Hindi journalists or journalists in regional languages?
Yeah, that's a good question. Your first,
Shobhana, should we take another question? We'll run out of time, and
Okay.
then you can do them both together. Yeah. Does anyone else have a question about social media, Twitter, and then I can take that too? No? Okay. So can we have the question at the back, please?
Actually, I think you've already touched upon the question that I had to ask the question over here. It was about broadcast journalism and about the current state of that in India. And, I despair at the levels to which I don't know whether we'd ever got there, but it's sunk to some very low level where there's no space at all for reasoned argument and objectivity. I think this is what I miss most of all when I'm watching television in India. It's this kind of opinions being screamed at you every night, and these 10 talking heads, as you said. So I wanted your views on that, and I think you've already touched upon it, so I won't waste more time.
So let's take.
No, so talking about Twitter, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's a very small proportion. We only have about 16 million users on Twitter. We are the second largest country on Facebook. After the United States, the second largest country on the Facebook platform is India. So over 130 million over there. And we have a large, over 70 million of WhatsApp users who are actually constantly sharing content and sharing information. So Twitter is small but hugely influential. And we try and use Twitter almost as an ally of people of a sort of interconnected community. So we have a tool called Data Miner that helps us dig deep into Twitter and see shifts in sentiments. So we immediately spot shifts in sentiments. We also track important people through Twitter. Very often we get breaking news. So no, Twitter isn't really a threat at all. In fact, if at all, we have learned how to collaborate with social platforms because they have a far deeper engagement with the audiences than we do. And they are here to stay. So either we sort of, collaborate with them and get as large a share as possible in terms of revenues, brand loyalty, and in terms of getting the connect with community, or we sort of, learn to innovate, but that is going to take a while. So in the short term, we have to do both. So I see Twitter as being a very collaborative part of a media strategy. In fact, we use this tool, Data Miner, only to be digging into Twitter all the time. So I think it's actually, it gives us lots of leads. And we involve our readers in decision making. They respond to stories. Very often we get exclusive pictures and data sent through readers. So it's a very collaborative effort.
I mean, for the English circulation of Hindustan Times, the overlap with Twitter users is probably much higher than, but the trends in the English-speaking world,
So, for instance, Prime Minister Modi wanted to invite President Obama to be the chief guest for Republic Day. He never sent a formal invite. He actually invited him over Twitter. Now, that's breaking news. Whether I run a Hindi paper or a Uriya paper or a Bengali paper, who cares? It could be 14 million users, but every single paper had to carry it. And then President Obama responds that, yes, he's going to come again on Twitter. So you can't ignore Twitter. It's 14, 15 million, but it's hugely powerful.
Yeah. Okay. So.
And it cuts across languages.
Could I just ask it? I'm pretty loud.
No, it's being recorded, so.
This was about the point that you made, media promoters having political associations. and the first part of your conversation was about the business of media. Journalism, to me, first and foremost, has always been the face of freedom of speech. So my question to you essentially is that with the commerce-driven media that it has become today, and families owning business media and with political associations, and the state becoming what it has become, where do you see the future of the freedom of speech? And a counter question to that would be, how does the accountability of media come into this? Who sets the agenda for that?
The readers, the consumers. Nobody has a monopoly any longer. In fact, what technology has done is been a great leveler. It's democratized the media. Because today, you can have your voice on the media. You no longer need somebody with deep pockets to be able to finance you, to give you the platform. So at the end of the day, it's a reader's choice. And to me, that is the best kind of, it's the best validation of what you're doing. If on the one hand, you are sort of espousing a certain cause or a certain line, which is not keeping in with what your readers want, what your target audience wants, they have options. There's no brand loyalty left. At the end of the day, you are in a very competitive market space, and technology has been a great leveler that today nobody needs. You have so many online magazines. You have so many online sites for opinion. You have people breaking news. You don't need deep pockets. And you are competing with each and every one of them. So either you have a product and you rise to the occasion, or you don't. So to my mind, the greatest validation of what you're doing actually comes from your readers. They're no longer compelled to be with you. So if what you're saying is correct, that freedom of expression, nobody is challenging that. There are enough and more sites, blogs, magazines, online. You no longer need deep pockets. And that, to me, is the greatest check and balance that the industry has.
If I may add to that, I mean, there's a distinction between, you're quite right, I agree, the freedom of expression per se, in terms of airing opinions and what we're saying about television, or indeed about blogs and so on. Yes, that's democratized. Anyone can have their say. You don't need to. But journalism, as we understand it, investigative journalism, which you almost never hear about that much, is about not just about saying what you think, whatever kind of view you have. It's not about opinion. It's about investing in an infrastructure. It's about gathering evidence. It's about paying people to go out and look for the stories, to work on to chase leads, etc., which does require money.
But not the kind of money that traditional media required. You don't need equipment. You don't need capital expenditure. You don't need to put in 15, 20, 30 million in buying a printing press. You don't need towers to broadcast. So the capital investment that journalism requires today has drastically gone down.
Yeah. So hopefully
that's the reason why you see so many so many investigative magazines as well.
Yeah.
Totally digital.
Yeah. I mean, I can think of Scroll and Wire.
I was about to say,
yeah.
We've had so many in the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah. There's been a real flowering. Okay. Yeah. So.
So, Madam, if I may ask, we have seen recently that almost all media houses have some kind of affiliation to certain political parties, and there are certain biasness. Before coming to this, talk, I did some research, and I saw an interview of you in News Laundry, and you said that you believe in a Congress ideology than a BJP ideology. So, can I assume that Hindustan Times is more Congress biased than BJP?
I wouldn't say that. I do remember the interview to News Laundry, and I said that we believe in a more centrist secular approach. Now, when you look at the various political parties, the Congress's ideology seems to fit the more centrist secular approach than the BJP's does. But the economic agenda of the BJP, to my mind, is a lot more what we've constantly endorsed. If you've also been a reader of Mint, you'll see that Mint has been constantly endorsing the so-called economic agenda that the BJP has espoused and not the Congress. So it depends where. If you're asking me about the beef ban, perhaps I would go with the Congress ideology. If you're asking me for the rollout of GST and many other reforms, I think I would go with the BJP. So I think it's very issue-based, and that's what the newspaper reflects. And if you were to care to read the edits of the paper, you would see ample support of endless number of policies, whether it was a land acquisition bill, which was thwarted by the Congress, or whether there was criticism of the land acquisition bill that was brought in during the UPA days. And so you have to read the articles and opinion to actually form your opinion.
Thank you.
Good evening, ma'am. I wanted to ask you, considering the popularity that online media is gaining in today's world, the online journals, the e-readings that we have with the applications coming in, do you think print media has a dim future, back in India especially? And do you think it affects the HT particularly per se?
It certainly does. I mean, we have headroom for literacy in India, and that's the reason why you're seeing growth, because as people migrate from the illiterate pool to the literate pool, the first point of contact becomes a newspaper. So because of this headroom for literacy, we have growth, and we are going to see growth at least in the vernacular for the next decade. I mean, I can't forecast what may happen after that. But as far as the English business is concerned, I constantly tell my team that always feel that you have a runway of 2 years and no more. And we are fortunate if we get an extension beyond that. But let's not plan for 4 years, 5 years, because, you know, you can't defy international trends. There can be a lag effect, and that's it. But if you're seeing a certain trend that's sort of very widely spread all over, India is bound to follow. We have the luxury of time, and that's about it. And if we don't, within that time, adapt to a different revenue model and a different business model, we will perish. So it is something which is of huge concern to all of us in terms of having an alternative business model.
Yeah.
Good evening, ma'am. In my opinion, like today, the media is a bridge between the people and the government. And I think that's one of the reasons why today we are much more informed citizens. But then I also feel that media only broadcasts or portrays or writes only the interests that they have. Specific case, like when the monsoon session did not really function, the media was only talking about how the government is at fault, they're wasting the tax money and all of that. But I just felt that it wasn't activating the citizens. It wasn't telling them that it's your loss. I mean, the government is not working towards the national interest. Why is that the media only picks topics or picks peoples and actors to represent and not everybody at once? Especially in this.
You know,
this
I
instance.
don't agree with that assessment, and I'll tell you why. Firstly, as far as the monsoon session was concerned, the media was constantly bringing out charts to show how much of taxpayer money was being wasted. So one, it was not like the media was not informing the people, it was trying to instigate the people that, you know, come out against this drama that's being played out. You know, it's our money, it's the taxpayers' money that's actually being wasted because parliament is not functioning. The media was very critical of the opposition for actually blocking the house. So I would say that the media was critical of the government, but to a far lesser extent than it was actually of the opposition for not allowing the house to function. But, you know, going back to what I spoke about Twitter, and though it's very small, but you pick up trends, and I don't think the media can go totally following their own agenda, because you're no longer staying in a cocoon where, you know, your readers don't tell you what they think of you. That connection that has happened because of the social media is a reality, and it's a reality where on a daily basis, we have all these online howlers who are sort of abusing us if we haven't towed the line or we haven't picked up an issue often enough. So we can say they are trolls, but on the other hand, we have to be aware that, you know, we are no longer living in the days where we felt we could set the agenda. The agenda is pretty much being set by these online armies who constantly are howling at you if you don't follow what they think, you know, people are talking about. So I don't think we have the luxury of doing that. You know, newspapers could be in a sort of a vacuum where they decided what they wanted to do. But social has totally changed that.
That's really worrying, though,
Yeah.
isn't it? I mean, it's
Well, it is worrying because...
Crowdsourcing.
Yeah, it is, yeah. I mean, you can say that it's crowdsourced, kind of a check on our standards, but on the other hand, you can say it's trolling at its worst.
Yeah.
And I'd like to ignore it.
Yeah, yeah.
So it depends which way you want to see it.
The lady over there.
Hello. So More of a clarification question. Throughout the discussion, even this answer, we're talking about passing the onus on the viewer, of the reader. Like, you are going to present what the reader wants. But don't you think in that process, you are kind of foregoing what you started with, the vision that Hindustan Times started with? Like, I agree, business of business is business, so you're in a competitive space and you have to talk about Bablu in the well or leaked information. But where do you draw the line? Because it's like a parent-child thing. If a child would want something which is obnoxious, that doesn't mean parent is going to give it.
Yeah.
So where is that somebody like Hindustan Times, which has a legacy, or other players who are established, trustworthy players, would essentially then walk on that tightrope, whether you're falling into an unethical side of it or just running a business, then how good are you compared to these online out of the, I mean, probably working on the basement kind of journalism? So what are your views on that?
So you don't, and that's where you have to take a tough call, that very often you break with what you think is trending at the moment. And to go back to the Sheena Bora example, for instance, it was being played out like a soap opera all the time on television. Our competitor, and I won't take names, had a full page dedicated to Boras. We decided we will not do that. It was a very gruesome and a awful story which did dominate page one for a few days. But we decided after a couple of days that there are other issues of national importance, and therefore the story will still get mentioned, will still find space. But it's just the hierarchy of stories changes. You don't devote a full page, because that full page is then filled with all kinds of leaked gossip. So we decided to do away with it, and we didn't follow the trend. So you have to use your discretion and very often say that, okay, even though television was playing it out 24/7, and even competition was giving one full page every day, we decided not to do it. And we stuck to our decision. So there are enough times when you don't do that, but there are enough times also when you feel that all your readers are very sort of engrossed in a particular story, not necessarily of a scandalous nature, but stories which do have other ramifications, and you do sort of give the readers more information on a topic that they are wanting.
Okay, I think we have time for one final question here. Yeah. Oh, did you had one too? There's one in the front. Okay, let's take them both quickly though.
I've observed that the BBC has recently ventured into the Indian media market on social media. How do you see this as affecting the industry as a whole, and what are your views on it?
Okay, and then let's take the question and then we'll stop.
Ma'am, I have a question. It's related to the Nepal earthquake and the media coverage of that. I'm not too sure if you're aware of it, but there was a Twitter hashtag that was trending saying, "Go home, Indian media." Do you really believe that at this stage, being an eminent member of the Indian press, do you think that the issue of sensitivity in media has not been given enough attention? And in this race for readership and TRPs, sometimes we forget that reporters also need to be sensitive about how they cover.
I totally agree. I mean, I felt that the Indian media does need to be more sensitive. There are certain cultural issues that need to be kept in mind. There are certain do's and don'ts which more mature media markets follow, which are very slowly becoming part of our media DNA. So for instance, how do you report, say, a terrorist activity? We've learned the hard way. We've learned we've learned through a lot of brickbats and all, but I really think that our media needs to mature a lot more, the electronic media. And I could totally empathize with, some of the comments. I saw that hashtag and I did see the outburst on Twitter, but there were many insensitive stories that were appearing, and less in the national media, but a lot in the vernacular media. And I think the media does need to have more sensitivity there. I mean, we have so many regional editions, and to be very honest with you, it's impossible for any one individual to be aware of what's going in. So there are enough times and more where not only me, but even the editors of various regional papers that we have are slightly upset with the coverage, because the more you sort of percolate, keep going down to district level, block level, we have different editions. The caliber of the talent that you get is not necessarily what you would want. And therefore, there is always that learning curve in trying to actually get the quality that you feel a brand has to stand for.
And do you want to take his question on BBC?
No, I think competition will only help everyone sort of get the act together and help the industry as a whole. I think competition is always good. It sets certain new standards and hopefully compels the media to also try and follow the standards if they are indeed higher. But on the other hand, if the local media does have a greater pulse on what's happening, then it's good competition for BBC as well.
By the way, the BBC is very well represented in this room, as is your paper and other journalists. So it's been a wonderful occasion actually to see this dialogue with journalists and students thinking about these issues. And you've been absolutely brilliant and patiently responding to each of them with such insight and honesty, I think. So thank you very much, Shobhana.
Thank you, Mukulika. Thank you.